Greetings to all our viewers tuning into our channel. In recent years, North America has been witnessing a quiet but powerful shift, one with the potential to reshape the future of the global electric vehicle industry. There's been no earth-shattering announcement, no grand stage, no carefully scripted speech. It all began with scattered but telling signs, the hum of machinery at a brand new $14 million battery plant in North Carolina, cobalt and nickel refining lines running at full capacity in Ontario, and an increasingly dense stream of investments flowing into Quebec. These seemingly separate signals, when pieced together, reveal a very clear picture. Toyota is shifting its strategic axis. What's surprising to observers isn't the fact that Toyota is expanding. That's expected from a global giant. What's truly astonishing is the direction they're heading, northward toward Canada. Not loudly, but quietly, deliberately, and with long-term calculation. A titan that Washington once believed to be firmly rooted in the US market is now placing its trust in a country considered the logistics gateway of North America, Canada, a nation emerging as a hub for critical minerals, refining, and cutting-edge technologies essential to the EV era. Why is Toyota doing this? Is it a short-term response to US tariffs, or is this a sweeping strategic overhaul that the rest of the industry has yet to fully grasp? Toyota's decisions don't appear to be knee-jerk reactions. They seem to be the result of years of observation, evaluation, and experimentation. A century-old company doesn't gamble on luck. These quiet movements speak volumes. The industrial power map of North America is being redrawn. And among the still faint lines, Toyota is the one making the first strokes, preparing for a restructuring that could shape the next decade. But to understand why this shift is happening and why it's happening now, we need to go back to where the tremor began, where the initial pressures surfaced, where Washington launched a wave of tariffs that sent shockwaves through the entire global EV ecosystem, because it was there that the Toyota Canada story first began to take form. And that brings us to the next chapter, the foundation of the crisis, the unprecedented pressures coming from Washington. Toyota didn't pull back from the US on a whim. They didn't suddenly turn away because of a passing political breeze. It all started with a blow that was hard, direct, and impossible to ignore. Tariffs from Washington. When the US government announced it was reviewing tariffs that could inflict up to $800 billion in damage on Japanese goods, including automobiles and components, the entire Japanese industrial sector was shaken. No corporation was big enough to stand outside that storm, not even Toyota. The Trump-era tariffs alone had already cost Toyota $1.25 billion in profit, a number heavy enough to derail any long-term strategic plan. And with forecasts predicting another 21% drop in profits by 2025, Toyota realized hesitation was no longer an option. But this isn't just a story about numbers. It reflects a deeper shift in Washington's mindset. America wants to reshape the industrial order in a way that serves its own interests first. Decades of frustration over trade deficits, fears of manufacturing job losses, and an ambition to rebuild national industrial strength have given rise to a new wave of protectionism, stronger, more aggressive, and at times unpredictable. Toyota found itself at the center of that storm. They were told to manufacture more on US soil, to comply with constantly changing standards, to bear the risks of political decisions beyond their control. The EV supply chain, delicate and precise like a circuit board, was continuously shaken by changes to steel tariffs, component duties, EV credit regulations, and currency fluctuations. A single adjustment could spike costs by billions of dollars. Ironically, the very projects the US had championed were also the ones facing the longest delays. The much-hyped EV plant in Kentucky has now been pushed back to mid-2026. Production lines need redesigning, technology approvals are dragging on, and the regulatory framework is shifting so quickly that investors can't keep up. A global corporation like Toyota can't build the foundation for its next 30 years in a policy environment that spins like a weather vane. And in the midst of all this uncertainty, a cold question emerged. Is the US still the right place to anchor the heart of the EV supply chain? A large market doesn't necessarily mean long-term stability. Generous policies don't always equal sustainable commitments. Toyota understood that the real issue wasn't just tariffs, it was the reliability of the entire policy framework. To solve this puzzle, they had to zoom out. The supply chain doesn't start at the factory. It starts with minerals. Not in Detroit, Kentucky, or Texas, but in the mines where nickel, lithium, and cobalt are extracted, the elements that define the entire future of the EV industry. And when Toyota examined that landscape, they realized something more critical than any tariff. America, despite its wealth of resources, is missing a vital link, a bottleneck that could choke the entire supply chain right at the source. That realization leads us to another, lesser discussed truth, one that could define the future of the global EV industry. Why is it that, even with the largest market in the world, the US still couldn't hold on to Toyota? And so we move on to the next chapter, where the bottleneck of an entire system begins to come into view. When Toyota took a hard look at its entire supply chain, it became clear that the issue wasn't with the factories already built or the half-finished tax agreements. The root of every EV strategy begins in one place, the battery. And to make batteries, the fundamental requirement is minerals and the capacity to refine them. This is precisely where America reveals a critical weakness. It's often said that the US is rich in natural resources, and that's true. There's lithium, nickel, cobalt. But having reserves doesn't mean having the ability to extract and refine them. In the EV race, refining isn't some secondary detail. It's the heart of the entire system. If the minerals aren't processed within countries that qualify as US trade partners, the resulting vehicle won't meet IRA standards. And that means losing thousands of dollars in tax incentives. For an EV, that amount alone can determine whether a customer makes the purchase or not. America may be sitting on mountains of minerals, but it can't refine them to spec. New mining projects face environmental barriers, lawsuits, local resistance, and approval processes that can drag on for years, sometimes even decades. Meanwhile, current refineries are heavily dependent on Chinese technology and supply, an element strictly prohibited in any supply chain that hopes to qualify under the IRA. It's a bitter paradox. The US wants to reduce reliance on China, but still can't stand on its own 2 feet. Other automakers might shift production to dodge tariffs, but batteries can't be dodged. Battery costs make up 30 to 40% of the total cost of an EV. If the mineral to refinement supply chain doesn't meet the standards, the entire billions worth of EV incentives vanish. In a fiercely competitive market, that's a direct hit to any manufacturer's advantage. Then there's logistics. Minerals must be transported from the mine to the refinery, from the refinery to the battery plant, and from the battery plant to the final assembly line. A bottleneck at any point can send costs spiraling, and Toyota sees this entire network operating under a policy environment in constant flux, where no one can say for sure if today's regulation will still exist a year from now. The delays in Kentucky, the complications with the Tacoma line in Texas, the murky definitions of localization under the IRA, they're all puzzle pieces pointing in the same direction. The US cannot provide the complete EV ecosystem that a global corporation needs to grow reliably. And at the moment Toyota confronted that limitation, they had to ask a critical question. If the US isn't enough, then who is? If the US has the market but lacks the foundation, where can Toyota find a place with resources, refining capacity, and stable policy? The answer didn't lie to the South. It didn't lie to the West. It was just North, where a country has spent years building its mineral infrastructure, where the refining chain is rapidly emerging, where policy doesn't swing with every election season, and where global corporations are flowing in like an inevitable current. We're talking about Canada, the missing piece Toyota needed most in its journey to rebuild the EV supply chain. And that's where our story enters a new chapter, the rise of Canada, and how this nation is becoming the perfect bridge between minerals and policy. While the US continues to wrestle with political calculations and supply chain bottlenecks, Canada, just to the north, has been pursuing an entirely different path, quiet, steady, and resolute. Without the fanfare of $100 billion incentives and untouched by the waves of sudden protectionism, Canada has built its strategy on one priceless asset, stability, something global corporations regard as gold. For over a decade, Ottawa has been investing consistently in areas the rest of the world largely overlooked: mining, refining, and supply chain infrastructure. Back when EVs were still a distant concept, Canada had already funneled over 6.44 billion CAD into the development of nickel, cobalt, and lithium, the elements now seen as the new oil of the 21st century. And while the US was still debating tax credits, Canada was pouring billions more into building out a full-fledged refining ecosystem in Ontario and Quebec. This wasn't preparation for today, it was preparation for the next 20 to 30 years. A strategic move by a country that understands its position on the North American industrial map. Canada may not have a market as large as the US, but it has what the US lacks: minerals, refining technology, and, most importantly, policy stability. In Canada, companies don't wake up each morning worried that a new executive order might wipe out their investment plans. They don't have to monitor every senator's statement or hold their breath during every election cycle. The Canadian government lays out long-term roadmaps and follows through with consistency, creating an environment where corporations can place their trust. Toyota saw that, Honda saw that, GM, Stellantis, and Volkswagen saw it too. And as these big names converge in Ontario, Quebec, the region is rapidly forming a powerful industrial cluster, a corridor where mineral mines, refining facilities, battery production plants, and EV assembly lines are seamlessly connected, from Toronto to Montreal. Beyond that, Canada holds a geographic advantage few can rival. Ontario and Quebec sit right next to Michigan, the heart of the US auto industry. This proximity allows companies to save significantly on transport costs and minimize supply chain risks. A battery produced in Ontario can be in Detroit within a few hours by truck, and from there, easily reach the plants of Toyota, Honda, or GM. Everything fits. Every piece locks perfectly into place. The minerals are there, the refining is in place, the infrastructure is built, the IRA localization thresholds are met, the policies are stable, and the location is strategic. It's the kind of ecosystem the US, for all its efforts, simply cannot replicate in the short term. And as the world steps into the EV revolution, Canada has suddenly become the foundation that every major player wants to stand on, not because of luck, but because of calculated, years-long preparation. Canada didn't chase a trend. It built a future, brick by brick, like a master builder laying the foundation for a structure meant to last for decades. Toyota understands that if it wants to build an industrial fortress for the EV era, it needs more than just resources. It needs vision. And that choice almost inevitably points to Canada. But Canada's rise is only half the story. The other half is how Toyota is quietly rearranging its entire system, from battery plants to assembly lines, from component supply chains to market strategies. It's a massive restructuring. No loud announcements, no grand declarations. But it's happening day by day. And that brings us to the next part, Toyota's quiet, calculated restructuring. In recent years, observing Toyota can be deceptively quiet. No flashy press conferences, no barrage of announcements, no bold proclamations of restructuring or industrial revolution. Yet behind that calm exterior lies a strategic blueprint being executed with almost cold precision. Toyota understands that the EV era isn't a sprint, it's a marathon, a test of endurance, of foundational strength, of the ability to weather decades of political and economic volatility. And to prepare for that journey, they didn't choose to confront the US head-on or withdraw from its most important market. Instead, they chose to reposition every piece, every production line, every supply chain link, quietly but purposefully. First, Toyota established a new axis for its battery supply chain: North Carolina, Ontario, Quebec. North Carolina is now home to a $14 billion battery hub, where Toyota is building high-capacity continuous production lines. But that's only the beginning. What Canada offers, from raw minerals to refining to a growing EV ecosystem, has become a natural extension of this strategy. Behind the scenes, Toyota has redirected its focus towards sourcing IRA-compliant minerals from nickel projects in Ontario, cobalt in Quebec, and lithium from mining zones prioritized by Ottawa. These materials are then refined within Canada, creating a clean and fully compliant supply chain under Washington's rules. Only after these critical steps are completed are the batteries shipped to North Carolina or other U.S. plants for final assembly. This combination has forged a supply corridor so resilient that even competitors have taken notice. A corridor free from dependence on Chinese minerals, safe from sudden tariff shocks, and insulated from the policy whirlwinds of the US Congress. It's as if Toyota is crafting a shield, one flexible enough to meet American market demands, but sturdy enough to withstand geopolitical storms. Beyond that, Toyota is fine-tuning its assembly and distribution system within the US. They're reassessing the Tacoma line in Texas, reevaluating automation levels at older plants, and standardizing processes to meet new IRA requirements. Wherever there's political risk, Toyota gradually reduces reliance. Wherever there's a chance to optimize cost, investment increases. And wherever a long-term foundation can be laid, Toyota makes the first move. These steps aren't loud, but they pack strategic force. Toyota isn't announcing a departure from the US, but every sign, every investment, every supply chain shift points to a pivot toward a new axis where they have more control and are less vulnerable to Washington's volatility. And it's that very silence that has begun to unsettle Washington. The US is realizing it no longer holds the dominant role in Toyota's EV strategy. Industrial towns that once hoped for an EV job boom are now watching investment flow north. Lawmakers are asking, why is Toyota choosing Canada? Why aren't US incentives enough to keep them here? Is Canada becoming a backdoor for foreign automakers to profit from the US market without investing proportionally in the US itself? Those questions are spreading, and they're turning into suspicion, even political pressure. And so the story enters a new chapter. America's response, one of concern, scrutiny, and mounting pressure on Toyota as Washington realizes that Toyota's silence is anything but harmless. Let's now move into the next part, how Washington is reacting to this quiet shift. As Toyota's quiet maneuvers gradually came into view, Washington could no longer stand by. In a country where every new factory translates to thousands of votes, any shift in investment becomes a political issue. And Toyota's pivot toward Canada stirred a deep sense of unease among American policymakers. It began with probing questions. Was Toyota bending the rules? Were they taking advantage of US-followed incentives while building their supply chain outside of American borders? But those questions quickly escalated into real concern as industrial states, especially Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky, began to realize the massive flow of capital they had counted on was now drifting north. Lawmakers from these states didn't hide their frustration. Some publicly accused Toyota of exporting jobs to Canada, arguing that Canada had become a legal backdoor for foreign automakers to benefit from the IRA while bypassing increased domestic production. Influential voices even called for a review of the tax incentives granted to Toyota's vehicles sold in the US, claiming that if the supply chain wasn't on American soil, Toyota shouldn't qualify for those benefits. This suspicion deepened as analysts highlighted a troubling reality. US policy may actually be pushing companies away, rather than attracting the investment Washington intended. Prolonged lawsuits over EV standards, constant changes in mineral classification rules, and fears of a new trade war have created such an uncertain investment environment that even American companies are struggling, let alone foreign firms. Toyota became the lightning rod of this debate, even though they said nothing, and that silence only further frustrated Washington. Because in American politics, silence can be the loudest statement of all, that Toyota no longer places full trust in the US the way it once did. To some politicians, that was a dangerous signal. If Toyota begins to shift away, others might follow. And if the auto industry, a symbol of American economic strength, no longer sees the US as a reliable anchor, what does that say about Washington's current industrial policy? Subsequent hearings in Congress made this anxiety even more visible. Questions like, why is Canada attracting global corporations better than we are? Or are we losing our leadership in the EV era? Were asked repeatedly. What the American political class truly fears isn't just the loss of a few factories, it's the potential loss of the US's central role in the North American industrial map. And while Washington struggled to respond, to recalibrate, to exert pressure, Toyota and Canada had already moved several steps ahead in rearranging the supply chain of an entire continent. America's growing unease only underscored a harsh truth. While the US was being held back by politics, Canada was advancing with strategy. At this point, the story is no longer just about Toyota. It begins to expand into a much larger picture. a restructuring that is redefining the entire North American landscape, where the roles of the US and Canada are no longer what they used to be, and Toyota has become the catalyst for that transformation. And so we arrive at the next chapter, Toyota in Canada, the restructuring of an entire continent. Looking at the recent movements of Toyota and Canada, it's becoming clear that this isn't just an investment deal or a supply chain adjustment. What's unfolding is structural, like watching a giant map being redrawn right before our eyes. Where once all industrial lines in North America converged around the United States as the irreplaceable center, that center is now beginning to share its role with a long overlooked partner, Canada. What's remarkable is that this shift hasn't come with noise. Quite the opposite. It's been quiet yet weighty. The US remains the largest consumer market, the technological hub, the standard setter for EV safety, tariffs, and industrial regulation. But Canada has emerged as the home of what the EV industry needs most: critical minerals, refining capacity, stable policy, and a trustworthy investment climate. Together, these two roles form what experts are calling a dual value chain, with the US leading on markets and regulation, and Canada underpinning the physical foundation of the entire system. Toyota was merely the first company to pivot openly toward this model. Others followed quickly. Honda with a $15 billion investment in Ontario, Volkswagen building a multi-billion-dollar gigafactory in St. Thomas, GM upgrading its battery lines in Quebec, Stellantis securing long-term contracts for domestic battery materials sourced from Canada. Together, they've created a wave that no country can now reverse. Piece the puzzle together, and a clear picture emerges. Canada provides critical minerals with high supply security. Refining facilities in Ontario and Quebec operate to IRA-compliant standards. The battery production ecosystem is flourishing thanks to dense corporate investment. And from there, it only takes a border crossing, a bridge, a truck to reach Michigan or Ohio, the beating hearts of the American auto industry. Everything is connected by a continuous industrial corridor, uninterrupted by political cycles or instability. That's why many experts are now calling this an emerging EV industrial belt, stretching from Ontario and Quebec through Detroit down to Ohio. This corridor could become the most vital production zone for electric vehicles in the Western Hemisphere over the next decade. And Toyota, without declaring it, now stands at the center of that restructuring. This transformation is not just industrial, it's geopolitical. North America, long seen as lagging behind China in the EV race, is now finding renewed momentum through this very US-Canada alignment. Instead of putting all bets on a single nation, the continent is adopting a collaborative model, one that complements strengths, mitigates risks, and capitalizes on geographic advantages. This is how a continent pivots in a new era, not through grandstanding declarations, but through quiet, resilient recalibration. Toyota didn't start this wave, but they were the first wind signaling the coming industrial quake. And what has followed shows their choice wasn't random, but a sharp prediction of the global EV industry's trajectory. From here, the story brings us to the final chapter. When Toyota chose Canada, they inadvertently rewrote the industrial map of North America. But what does that choice truly mean? And why might history look back on this moment as a turning point for an entire continent? Looking back on this entire journey, it becomes clear that Toyota was never running away from America, nor were they abandoning the market that had nurtured them for decades. What they were seeking was something simpler, yet more fundamental: a firmer footing, a place where their supply chain wouldn't be swept away by sudden political storms, where a business could plan for the long term without fearing that every election season might wipe out years of preparation. And Canada, with its abundant minerals, strong refining capabilities, and stable policies, emerged as the complete answer. In the EV era, what determines success is no longer just where factories are built, but who controls the strategic resources, who holds the refining capacity, and who provides a consistent environment for industrial capital to take root. What the US is still striving to build, Canada has been quietly preparing for years. And the moment Toyota chose Canada was the moment the world was forced to look again at the industrial map of North America. The center of gravity was no longer fixed in the south. It was shifting north, where a continent is finding its new balance. Years from now, when we reflect on this period, we may come to see Toyota's decision not just as a smart corporate move, but as a turning point, the moment that launched North America's industrial restructuring. A future where Canada and the US don't compete through policy, but complement one another through distinct, indispensable roles. And in that quiet shift, history may well record that it was Canada, not the United States, that laid the first brick of the EV era in North America. If you have a different perspective, questions, or deeper insights into this topic, feel free to share them in the comments below. That's how we broaden our understanding together in a world that's changing by the day. And if you enjoy this kind of geopolitical analysis, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video. Thank you for watching.